All right, let's now turn our attention to the big question of what India should actually do and handle the situation. It's a tricky position. India has had a long-standing support for the Palestinian cause. India is a very close strategic ally with many Arab countries, UAE, increasingly with other countries, including Saudi Arabia. And there's this new strategic relationship and alliance with Israel, and a big outpouring of support in recent days for Israel after the terror attack. So it's going to be a tough tightrope walk that India is going to have to follow. For more on that, we're now being joined by a former Indian ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. TS Tirumurti, who's lived in Gaza for actually 2 years as India's first representative to the Palestinian Authority. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. Just wanted to get your perspective. How do you think India should deal with this present situation? Because obviously, it's going to have to be quite a fine balancing line. Now, the Prime Minister came out immediately after the terror attack and condemned it. And yet now India is also trying to figure out all the other permutations and combinations in this.
Firstly, let me say that I think the Prime Minister's initial reaction was absolutely the correct one. He called it a terror attack, and then he expressed solidarity. And I think when you see the scale and the audacity, the brutality of what happened, shock and awe, it was a terror attack. And therefore, it was important to call it so. And once you call it a terror attack, there is no justification for terror. And that's something we have all agreed to internationally, that they cannot have a reason for a terror attack being given. So that, therefore, nothing can really justify a terror attack. And that is why it is extremely important to understand that a terror attack, condemning it, is quite different from the larger issue, which is the Palestinian issue. And we should not confuse the two, much as people may like to, confuse both these and try to bring it together. It is not correct. It's very, very different. Now, the policy which India has followed, and this I have mentioned it earlier in a couple of other occasions, is that we have tried to keep the bilateral relations with Israel separate from our relations with, or rather our stand on the Palestinian statehood. On the bilateral relations, we have grown very fast on technology and agriculture and a whole lot of things, and defense and trade. That's partly because we agreed to disagree. And we said that, yes, on the Palestinian track, we will support a two-state solution. And we do have differences with you on this. So we understood that there were two separate tracks.
Ambassador Tirumurti, some of the initiatives that India has been working on, does require peace and stability of some sort in the Middle East. Take I2U2, for example, very much an initiative that India has been part of. The relationship between the UAE and Israel and the USA and India. Normalization of Saudi Arabia and Israel is something that India perhaps would have been very keen on. Both are becoming close allies of India's. We've also been looking at this entire Middle East corridor connectivity. So this flare-up is clearly not something that India would be very happy about, and India would be hoping that things quieten down as fast as possible, even though that seems somewhat unlikely right now.
I think absolutely, it'll be this thing, but it's not going to quieten down, because I think at the end of the day, there's been a huge attack on Israel, and that they have themselves said that they will have to have a disproportionate response to it. That's what they have said. And so we have to be very, very very aware all this is going. But at the same time, I agree with you that, I2U2, they're all important initiatives per se, but they will all suffer some sort of an impact from this. Of course, the Middle East corridor is not a very current thing. It is actually a medium-term to a long-term type of vision which the countries have had.
Right, let's just turn our attention back to the immediate future now. India has clearly taken a very clear supportive stance on Israel, condemning the terror attack. Indians have been very prominent supporters of Israel on social media, for example, speaking up in favor of Israel. The NE has spoken about the longer-term positions also, such as two-state and so on and so forth. But looking a little bit in the next week or two, if a humanitarian crisis begins to emerge in Gaza with military operations happening, with switching off of electricity and water, there are scenes of suffering, do you think India is going to be forced to moderate its stance and start calling for restraint or some such things?
I think, as I was just mentioning, India has a very specific policy on these issues, and it hasn't changed. And we have called it for what it is. That is, it's a terror attack. But at the same time, our policy of keeping these two tracks, I think, still remains. And this is precisely why I think you heard the MEA spokesperson, and he was very clear that our traditional policy of two-state solution remains, and that has been our policy. And I have, when I was in New York as the Indian PR to the UN and in the Security Council, the Palestinian issue used to come every month. It is on the calendar. And I have reiterated what he has just mentioned on every occasion about direct negotiations. And so therefore, it's not a question of moderating our stand. It's a question of articulating our stand.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us and shedding light on the Indian position. And you're absolutely right. You've probably been expounding the Indian position many times at the United Nations and elsewhere. So it's good to get it directly from you what the actual Indian position on all of this is. Ambassador Tirumurti, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective.